Welcome to the History Maps podcast. When you think about a highway today, you generally picture asphalt, clear signs, maybe a straight line cut directly through the landscape.
Right. The entire purpose of modern infrastructure is to, well, completely defy nature.
Exactly. You get in a vehicle, you drive, you arrive. It's predictable, and it's largely frictionless.
Yeah, we expect a completely smooth journey. You are isolated from the actual environment you're passing through. So a modern highway is essentially an exercise in ignoring geography.
But when you step back into the medieval world and you look at what actually functioned as a highway back then, the friction is the entire point.
It is a defining feature, yeah.
We are looking at a transport network that did not pave over nature. It wrestled with it, and it did so brutally. Today, we are taking a deep dive into the source material surrounding the Varangian Way.
Which is an incredibly intense topic.
It really is. This was a massive, highly complex, nearly 3,000-kilometer medieval trade network. It connected Scandinavia all the way down through the continental interior to the Byzantine Empire. And it was operating primarily from the 8th to the 11th centuries.
It is the absolute definition of a logistical gauntlet. I mean, we are talking about moving massive amounts of cargo through freezing waters, over treacherous mud, and, right past hostile armies.
And to figure out how they actually pulled this off, we have a very revealing stack of sources. We aren't just relying on later historical summaries here.
No, we have some fantastic primary texts.
Right, like the Russian Primary Chronicle, which was compiled in the early 12th century.
And we'll be looking really closely at the detailed bureaucratic accounts left by the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII.
Yes, his manual on statecraft.
Exactly. It's called De Administrando Imperio. And it gives us this almost disturbingly precise look at the logistics of this route.
It's so detailed. And we also have the vivid, very personal writings of the Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, who physically encountered these northern traders in person.
Which is a crucial perspective. And we are also pairing all those written accounts with hard physical evidence. There is extensive archaeological data from critical settlement sites, places like Staraya Ladoga in the extreme north, and Gnezdovo, which is further south on the river network.
So our mission for this deep dive is to completely deconstruct how this complex river highway actually functioned.
We need to look at the mechanics.
Right, the mechanics of the journey, the severe physical and human obstacles these traders overcame. And we want to examine how this intense exchange of goods fundamentally forged the geopolitical and cultural foundations of Eastern Europe.
It's a huge shift. And to understand it, we really have to start in the late 8th and early 9th centuries. This is the era we broadly categorize as the Viking Age.
Right. And when most people study this period, the focus tends to drift westward.
Almost exclusively, yeah.
You have Norsemen expanding toward Britain, sacking coastal monasteries, moving into Francia, and they eventually reach Iceland and North America.
But there was another distinct movement happening simultaneously. A specific group, predominantly Swedes, known as the Varangians, pushed eastward across the Baltic Sea.
It's helpful to think of the Varangians almost like prospectors in a resource rush.
That's a good way to frame it.
But instead of gold in the mountains, they were after a very specific form of wealth. They were deliberately ignoring those more familiar, maybe easier Western sea routes.
Yeah, they were actively choosing to plunge into a dense, heavily forested continental interior. And they did it to chase a highly valued global currency.
The Islamic silver dirhams.
Exactly. The Islamic caliphates in the Middle East, particularly the Abbasid Caliphate headquartered in Baghdad, were experiencing a massive economic boom at this time.
A total golden age.
Right. And as part of that boom, they were minting just vast quantities of high-quality silver coins. The dirham was essentially the reserve currency of the medieval world.
Because it was so reliable, right?
Yeah. It had a highly standardized weight and a very high purity level. If you were a Norse trader, you wanted that silver. It didn't matter that it had Arabic script on it.
It's just metal to them.
Exactly. It mattered that it was pure, meltable, tradable wealth.
And the Varangians obtained that silver by trading high-value northern commodities. We're talking about luxury furs.
Yes, and not just your standard animal skins.
Right. Premium, high-status furs, sable, ermine, squirrel, and black fox.
These furs were incredibly highly prized in the Islamic world. A sable coat in Baghdad was a massive status symbol. It was akin to, wearing a very exclusive designer label today.
And the environment of the north produced animals with exceptionally thick, rich pelts.
Absolutely. And alongside the furs, the Varangians traded amber, honey, wax, and unfortunately human captives, slaves taken from the Slavic and Finnic populations they encountered.
The volume of this trade is just staggering when you look at the numismatic evidence. I mean, the study of the physical coins. Over 75,000 of these silver dirhams have been physically found buried in hoards across Scandinavia.
Mostly in modern-day Sweden and the island of Gotland.
Yeah. And those are just the ones archaeologists have actually dug up.
Right. The real number is much higher.
Some modern estimates suggest the actual number of coins buried in Viking Age contexts across the Baltic region could reach nearly 500,000.
Which is just a massive, sustained transfer of wealth from the Middle East into Northern Europe. It fundamentally altered the economy of Scandinavia.
It shifted them from a purely localized agricultural and raiding economy right into a globalized trade network.
But, this raises a massive logistical question.
It really does. If you are a seafaring people and your entire technological advantage is based on the open ocean sailing across the North Sea, navigating coastal tides, how do you even know that a route through a dense continental landmass is feasible?
Right, you cannot just look at a coastline and guess that there's a river network leading all the way to the Black Sea.
So how did they know?
Well, they didn't. The Varangians did not discover this route overnight with a map. It really comes down to the specific geography of the East European plain, combined with a process of slow, incremental discovery.
Over several generations, I assume.
Exactly. If you look at the landscape of European Russia, the area west of the Ural Mountains, it is generally very flat. But there is a crucial, slightly elevated area called the Valdai Hills.
So we aren't talking about a towering mountain range here.
No. The Valdai Hills are relatively low, but because the surrounding plain is so entirely flat, they act as a massive hydrographic hub.
Okay.
They are the highest point in that specific region, which means they provide the headwaters for several major divergent river systems.
It's like a central distribution point for water?
That's a perfect way to put it. From this one elevated area, you have the Volga River flowing east and south toward the Caspian Sea. You have the Doricheb River flowing directly south toward the Black Sea. And you have the Western Dvina flowing west toward the Baltic Sea.
So if you can somehow navigate your way from the Baltic coast inland and actually reach the Valdai Hills, you suddenly have access to a network of watery highways leading basically anywhere on the continent.
It is a natural interchange. And initially, in the 8th century, Scandinavian fur trappers were not trying to reach Baghdad or Constantinople.
They were just looking for local goods.
Right. They were making exploratory, localized ventures across the Baltic Sea, pushing into the Gulf of Finland. They were interacting with local Finnish and Slavic tribes, largely looking for better hunting grounds to avoid resource depletion back home in Sweden.
So they are just pushing a little further up the river valley east.
Yeah, exactly. As they moved further inland to trap animals and trade with local populations, they began to map out these interconnected river systems.
It's just through trial and error.
Yeah, and they started to realize that the rivers did not just end in the forest. They kept going. And eventually, they linked up with other merchants coming up from the south who already had Islamic silver.
Ah, so they meet in the middle.
Right, and once they realized these rivers were the absolute key to reaching the wealthy markets of the south and the east, the motivation shifted entirely. It went from localized trapping to long-distance transport.
But knowing rivers exist and actually navigating them are two very different things. They had to physically conquer an incredibly demanding inland landscape. Let's trace the exact path they established for the Varangian Way heading toward the Byzantine Empire.
Sure. So the eastern route typically began in major Scandinavian trading centers, places like Birka in Sweden or the island of Gotland. The fleets would cross the Baltic Sea and enter the Gulf of Finland.
Okay.
From there, they had to navigate the Neva River for about 74 kilometers.
Which takes them directly into Lake Ladoga. And Ladoga is not just a pond. I mean, it is the largest lake in Europe.
Yes, it is massive.
It has its own weather systems, its own unpredictable storms.
It is a truly formidable body of water. Once they finally reached Lake Ladoga, they established the settlement of Staraya Ladoga near its southern shore.
And that becomes a base camp.
Exactly. This became a crucial gateway settlement, a place to rest, repair ships, and prepare for the really difficult inland push. Because from Staraya Ladoga, the journey became significantly harder.
Because now they are going against the flow.
Right. They had to travel upstream, actively fighting the current, along the Volkhov River for over 200 kilometers to reach Lake Ilmen, passing near where the major trading hub of Novgorod would eventually develop.
Let's just pause on the reality of traveling upstream for 200 kilometers. Here's where the sheer physical exhaustion of this journey becomes apparent. We are so used to the idea of Vikings sailing swiftly on the wind across the ocean.
Oh yeah, the classic image.
But rowing against a river current, heavily loaded with cargo, is an entirely different beast. It is like pushing a heavily loaded freight cart up a muddy incline for 6 weeks straight.
It's grueling work.
How did they manage the sheer labor required for this, and what kind of ships were they actually using?
Well, it required a profound shift in maritime technology. Initially, the Norse used their own traditional ships, the shallow draft, clinker-built longships.
Let's explain that term for a moment for you listening. Clinker built, that refers to the way the wooden planks of the hull actually overlap each other rather than sitting flush edge to edge, right?
Yes, exactly. The planks are riveted together where they overlap, and this construction method makes the ship incredibly flexible.
Which is good for rough water.
Very good. In the open ocean, a clinker-built ship can twist and flex with the waves without breaking apart. And in a river setting, that flexibility helps absorb the shock of hitting submerged logs, rocks, or sandbars.
Because you are going to hit things in a shallow river.
Constantly. These ships also had a very low draft, meaning they sat high in the water, which is absolutely essential for navigating those shallow river channels.
They also featured reversible rowlocks, which I found really notable.
That is a crucial detail for river navigation. Reversible rowlocks meant the crew could simply turn around on their benches, flip the oars, and row in the opposite direction without having to physically turn the entire ship around.
That makes total sense. If you are in a narrow river channel and you hit a dead end or a sudden hazard, the ability to instantly reverse thrust is a lifesaver.
It really is. But those long ships, especially the larger cargo vessels, were heavy.
Oh, right.
Once you load them down with heavy barrels of honey, blocks of wax, and tons of fur, rowing them against the current becomes brutally inefficient.
It just burned too much energy.
Exactly. So as the route became more formalized, the Varangians adapted their strategy. They realized bringing large ocean-going vessels deep into the interior was just a waste of energy. Instead, they started relying on what the Byzantine texts call monoxyla.
Monoxyla literally translates to single wood. We are talking about dugout boats here.
Right. These were lightweight dugout boats, crafted from a single massive tree trunk, usually oak or linden. They were much smaller than a longship, much lighter, and specifically designed for this kind of inland river travel.
And the really fascinating part here is that the Varangians were not the ones out in the forest chopping down the trees and building these dugouts.
No, the construction of the monoxyla was entirely outsourced.
They subcontracted it out.
Essentially, yes. They were built by the local Slavic and Finnic tribes, such as the Kravicians and the Drevlians, who lived along the river networks. According to Emperor Constantine VII's specific accounts, these subject tribes would go into the forests during the freezing winter months.
Think about the mechanics of that for a second. You don't have modern chainsaws. You're felling a massive oak tree in the dead of winter.
The ground is frozen, the wood is freezing.
And to hollow it out, they likely used a combination of controlled burns along the top of the log, followed by intense manual labor. Scraping out the charred wood with iron adzes, all in sub-zero temperatures.
It was incredibly labor-intensive. The tribes would hollow out these rough holes during the winter. Then when the ice melted in the spring, they floated these unfinished, raw hulls down the smaller tributary rivers to major assembly points.
The cities that were developing into hubs, right?
Right, places like Kiev or Smolensk.
And the Varangians would arrive at these hubs, purchase, or basically demand these hulls, and then fit them out.
They did the final finishing work.
Right. They would take the preserved tackle, the oars, the specialized reversible rowlocks, and the sails from the previous year's ships, and attach them to the fresh monoxyla hulls.
It is an extremely organized system. It is essentially a forced lease program. The Varangians leveraged local labor through a tributary system to secure the vehicles they needed. They were combining local Slavic woodworking with advanced Scandinavian nautical gear.
This integration of local labor and Varangian maritime skill was essential for making the route viable. Pulling and rowing these vessels upstream was physically grueling, but the true tests of survival on the Varangian Way were not the long stretches of open river.
No, not at all.
The absolute most dangerous parts of the journey were the stretches where the rivers simply ended, or where the water became too violent to sail.
Which brings us to the portages and the rapids.
Right. This is where the route shifts from being just exhausting to being actively punishing. Let's look at a specific choke point here. The Levitt to Dnieper portage, located near the settlement of Gnezdovo.
Okay, so if you're traveling south, you've taken your boat as far up the Levitt River as the water will allow.
The river gets too shallow, and it essentially just ends. Now you have to somehow reach the Dnieper River to continue heading south toward the Black Sea.
And this is a major watershed divide. You are crossing from rivers that flow north to rivers that flow south. The portage here required hauling the boats, or at the very least the heavily loaded cargo, completely overland for approximately 10 kilometers.
10 kilometers of dragging boats through the wilderness, and this isn't a paved path.
Oh no.
We are talking about dense pine forests, swampy terrain, uneven ground, and just deep mud.
They used heavy wooden rollers, laying down logs in front of the boats and pushing them forward, constantly moving the back logs to the front.
That is just punishing work.
And they also used sledges for the cargo. It required immense, highly coordinated human labor. Every single person on the expedition, including the slaves they were transporting to sell, would have been harnessed to these vessels to drag them across the land.
It is a staggering physical feat. But even after you survive that portage and you reach the Dnieper River, you put the boats back in the water and you start heading downstream with the current water. The danger does not stop.
No, in fact, it escalates.
Because you hit the cataracts.
The Dnieper Rapids were legendary in the medieval world. There were 7 major cataracts spread over a 70-kilometer stretch of the river. Over that distance, the water dropped a total of 38 meters in elevation.
To put that into perspective, imagine a river dropping the height of a 12-story building over a relatively short stretch, forcing massive volumes of water through jagged granite outcrops.
It's practically a waterfall in places.
Exactly. It created violent, churning rapids that were entirely unnavigable by standard rowing or sailing. If you tried to sail through, your wooden boat would be shattered into splinters.
Constantine VII documents these rapids in intense detail in De Administrando Imperio. He actually provides both their Scandinavian and Slavic names.
Which is a really revealing piece of linguistic evidence, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It shows how intertwined the cultures traveling the route had become. But he describes the specific procedures for getting past them. At the first rapid, the merchants had to disembark, leaving their heavy goods on board.
Okay.
The crew would strip off their garments, wade into the freezing, rushing water, and physically guide the boats by hand. They used long poles to keep the hulls from smashing against the rocks.
Wading into a rushing river, waist-deep in freezing water, trying to hold back a fully loaded wooden boat from accelerating into a rock face. And that was considered the easy method.
Yes, because at the fourth barrage, which Constantine refers to by its Norse name Afor, or the unharnessing, the water was simply too violent to even attempt wading. The river was a chaotic mess of whitewater and sharp granite.
So what is the protocol for A4? You can't wade, you can't sail.
The merchants were forced to beach the boats completely. They had to unload every single piece of cargo, all the heavy furs, the wax, and the chain captives. Then they had to carry everything overland for about 9 kilometers to bypass the rapid.
Just picking it all up and walking.
Exactly. And the boats themselves either had to be dragged overland or carried along the rocky shore until the river calmed down enough to relaunch.
Constantine also mentions a rapid called Isupi, which translates to "do not sleep,"
which is very ominous.
That name alone highlights the extreme psychological toll of this segment. You are physically drained from carrying boats, you are freezing, and you are constantly on edge. And you had to be on edge, because it wasn't just the rushing water you had to fear.
No. While the crews were vulnerable on land,
Yeah.
hauling their ships and cargo at a literal crawl, they were actively being hunted.
By the Pechenegs.
Right.
Yeah.
The surrounding steppes were controlled by the Pechenegs. They were a powerful, highly mobile, Turkic nomadic confederation. They were expert horsemen and archers, and they viewed these slow-moving merchant caravans as prime targets.
Let's construct a scenario here to really drive home the reality of this. Think about having to change a flat tire on a massive freight truck.
Okay.
You have to do it entirely by hand, using heavy manual jacks. You are doing this in deep mud, and while you are doing it, you are actively being hunted by a heavily armed militia hiding in the tree line, just waiting for you to drop your guard.
It's terrifying.
That is the reality of the portages and the rapids. The Pechenegs did not have to guess where the Varangians were going. They knew exactly where the boats had to stop.
Constantine explicitly mentions locations like the Fort of Rar. This was a narrow, rocky crossing on the river dominated by Pecheneg allies. The boats were forced to slow down there and were highly susceptible to ambush from the high banks.
The threat was not theoretical, it was severe. In 972, A massive Rus force, led by Prince Sviatoslav I, was returning up the river. They were ambushed by the Pechenegs at these very rapids.
The whole force was caught out.
The Rus force was completely destroyed, and Sviatoslav I was famously beheaded. According to the chronicles, the Pecheneg Khan had Sviatoslav's skull lined with gold and used it as a drinking cup.
Which is quite the statement.
Yeah, the mortality rate on this route had to be substantial. You are losing men to disease, to the rapids, and to nomadic arrows constantly.
Given that reality, the obvious question is how any merchant could justify this level of risk. Why embark on a journey where death is a highly probable outcome?
Well, the profits at the end of the line in Constantinople had to be so immense that they completely outweighed the risk of a violent death.
The economic pull was that strong.
But the Varangians were methodical. They did not just load up a boat, paddle down a dangerous river, and hope for the best. They developed a complex system of distributed security.
We need to look at what distributed security actually means in this context. It means they recognized they couldn't just travel through a hostile wilderness in a single, vulnerable convoy. They actively built permanent infrastructure to protect their investment along the route.
They basically built medieval truck stops.
Essentially, yes. Settlements like Staraya Ladoga in the extreme north and Gazdovo near that major Lovett portage were not just casual marketplaces where people met to swap goods. They were heavily fortified outposts.
Military bases, almost.
Right. They had earthworks, timber walls, and permanent garrisons of armed men.
So they functioned as safe havens in a very dangerous landscape. You could retreat behind a wall if the local tribes or nomads got aggressive.
They created a critical layer of defense and logistical support. You simply could not navigate the route without stopping at these nodes. You needed to stop to pay tolls to the local chieftains. You needed to acquire specialized local pilots who knew the treacherous, shifting sandbars of the rivers, and, crucially, to gather intelligence on nomadic movements.
So they wouldn't just sail blind.
Right. The sagas and chronicles actually mention that travelers moving south were required to send messengers ahead to fortified hubs like Novgorod. They had to secure a temporary truce and a guarantee of safe passage before proceeding into the next territory.
The security of the route was intricately tied to the political and military control of these key settlements.
Exactly.
But maintaining standing armies, building massive timber fortresses, and provisioning these outposts requires an enormous amount of capital. A few independent merchants trading furs couldn't fund this on their own.
Definitely not.
To fund this massive logistical undertaking and to ensure their survival against nomadic ambushes, the Varangians established a ruthless, highly structured economic model over the local populations.
This brings us directly to the internal economics of the route, which was underwritten by a mechanism known as the polyudai.
The polydai. That translates roughly to going among the people. It was an annual tribute circuit conducted by the Kievan Rus princes.
And the timing of the polyudai is crucial to understand. It occurred during the winter.
Because the rivers were frozen.
Right. When the rivers were frozen solid, travel south to Byzantium was impossible. The trading fleets were completely grounded. So the princes and their heavily armed retinues, the professional warrior class, known as the Drusina, would leave their stronghold in Kiev.
And they would travel by sledge.
Yes, traveling by sledge through the territories of their subject tribes, such as the Drevlians and the Krivitians.
And we need to be very clear here about what they were doing. They were not engaging in fair trade with these tribes.
No, not at all.
They were extracting quotas. The polyi demanded specific, non-negotiable amounts of valuable resources. Premium pelts, massive barrels of honey, blocks of wax, and human captives.
This extracted tribute formed the core inventory they desperately needed for the massive summer voyage south. The entire system was not a peaceful free market.
It was extortion.
It was an economy built entirely on extortion and the constant threat of violence. The Drushina needed wealth to remain loyal to the prince, and the prince needed the Drushina to extract the wealth. It was a brutal, self-sustaining cycle.
There is a very telling historical anecdote about Prince Igor in 945 that illustrates exactly how fragile and violent this extraction process could be.
The Russian primary chronicle details his demise very clearly.
Right.
Prince Igor had just completed his standard, agreed-upon winter tribute collection from the Drevlian tribe. His men had taken what was owed, but as they were heading back, his Drushina began complaining that they were not as wealthy as the retinues of rival princes.
They wanted more.
Dissatisfied with his haul and needing to appease his men, Igor made a fatal miscalculation. He dismissed the bulk of his army to return to Kiev with the goods, and he took a small retinue back into Drevlian territory.
To demand a second, entirely unscheduled round of tribute. He essentially tried to double tax them through sheer intimidation, but he didn't have his main army to back it up. The Drevlians, pushed beyond their economic limit and seeing his vulnerable position, revolted.
They seized the opportunity.
According to the accounts, they captured Prince Igor, and their method of execution is a stark reminder of the brutality of this era. They bent two massive birch trees down to the ground, tied Igor's limbs to the trees, and then released them.
Physically tearing him apart.
Right. It highlights the underlying tension. The Kievan Rus state relied on this wealth, but pushing the subject populations too hard resulted in violent backlash.
However, despite these localized revolts, the system largely functioned. The immense volume of goods extracted through the Polyudi was gathered in Kiev in the spring.
When the ice thawed.
Right. Loaded onto the Monoxyla fleets and transported down the Dnieper past the rapids and the Pechenegs to be traded in the south.
And what were they trading for? I mean, they are bringing down furs, wax, and slaves. What are they bringing back up the river?
They were seeking high-value southern imports. Primarily, the Rus was bringing back Byzantine silk.
Silk wasn't just a fabric back then, was it? It was heavily regulated state technology.
It absolutely was. The Byzantine state held a strict monopoly on high-quality silk production. It was highly regulated and just hugely prized across Europe. We have commercial records indicating that a single piece of premium Byzantine silk could cost 50 gold coins.
50 gold coins for a piece of fabric, that is an astronomical sum.
It really was. And alongside silk, they brought back spices from the East, elaborate glassware, enamel jewelry, and wine.
Let's look at the broader economic evolution here. We started with Norse trappers trading furs for Islamic silver dirhams. How does this interaction with Byzantium change their economy?
It marks a massive transition in how they functioned. Initially, the Varangians operated on a decentralized barter system.
Heavily favoring those Islamic silver dirhams, right?
Right, because of their standardized weight. It was a very practical, raw material economy. But as they integrated more deeply with the highly structured Byzantine Empire, their economy shifted. They moved away from a reliance on decentralized silver and moved toward a centralized state-run monopoly that dealt in Byzantine gold.
Specifically, the Byzantine solidus. Explain the solidus and why that distinction matters.
The solidus was the gold coin of the Byzantine Empire. Unlike the silver dirham, which was valued primarily for its raw metal weight and was often literally hacked into pieces to make exact change.
Oh, hack silver, right.
Yes, hack silver. But the solidus was different. It represented the centralized economic power of the Roman state. Dealing in gold solid meant dealing directly with imperial authorities, signing treaties, and operating within a strictly regulated commercial framework.
And the luxury goods they purchased with this gold, the silk, the enameled jewelry, they served a vital social function back north, didn't they? They weren't just hoarding this wealth in a chest in a longhouse.
No, they were using these imported Byzantine luxuries to actively construct social hierarchy. The Rus elites used these items to legitimize their political power over the local Slavic populations.
It's all about visibility.
Exactly. If you are a commoner wearing rough wool and the local prince rides past wearing vibrant purple Byzantine silk, displaying gold enameled pendants, it physically and visually separates the ruling class from the governed.
It says, I have access to a world you can't even imagine.
The trade route didn't just bring wealth. It transformed the very structure of their society, taking them from tribal chieftains to a visible, codified aristocracy.
The culmination of this entire vast engine of extraction, the physical torment of the mud portages, the terror of the rapids, the constant threat of Pecheneg ambush, and the brutal taxation of the Polyude. The reward for surviving all of that was arriving at the greatest, wealthiest city of the medieval world.
Constantinople.
The Varangians called it Miklagard, which simply translates to the Great City.
And the scale of Constantinople would have been genuinely mind-bending for someone arriving from Scandinavia.
Just incomprehensible.
A large Norse settlement might have a few hundred people living in timber longhouses. Constantinople had a population of hundreds of thousands. It had massive stone fortifications in the form of the Theodosian walls, towering aqueducts, paved streets, and the monumental dome of the Hagia Sophia.
But before the Rus fleets could even reach the city gates and gaze at all this architecture, there were rituals of survival to perform. After finally passing the last of the dangerous Dnieper rapids, the fleets would sail out into the estuary and stop at the island of St. Gregory.
Constantine VII notes this specific ritual, which is fascinating. The crews would drag their boats ashore, and beneath the massive oak tree on the island, they would sacrifice live roosters.
They were offering thanks to their gods for surviving the cataracts.
Exactly. They would cast lots using wooden rune sticks to decide whether to slaughter the birds, eat them, or just let them live. It was a crucial psychological release after weeks of intense, sustained danger.
Following the sacrifices, they would spend several days refitting their ships. They had to transition from river navigation back to open ocean sailing.
Which requires different gear.
Right. They attached new sails, stepped taller masts, and fixed heavier rudders to make the vessels seaworthy for the open water crossing of the Black Sea.
And they did not usually sail straight across the center of the Black Sea.
It's too risky.
Yeah, they would hug the western coastline, sailing south, stopping at the mouths of major rivers like the Dniester and the Danube to resupply, before finally arriving at the Straits of the Bosphorus in Constantinople, usually around August.
And when they finally arrived, after months of travel and near-death experiences, they don't just pull up to a dock and wander into the city to sell their furs.
Oh, definitely not.
The Byzantines were incredibly paranoid and highly organized. They had very specific protocols for dealing with these northern traders. We have the actual details of these protocols preserved in several major treaties signed between the Kievan Rus and the Byzantine Empire, specifically the treaties from the years 907, 911, and 944.
These treaties are just fantastic historical documents because they outline a highly regulated, almost clinical commercial relationship. The Byzantines knew exactly who they were dealing with.
They weren't taking any chances.
The risen merchants were absolutely not allowed inside the main city walls to live or set up camp. They were confined to a specific designated suburban district called the St. Mamas Quarter, which was located outside the walls along the Golden Horn.
It sounds incredibly similar to a highly regulated modern Olympic village, or maybe a strictly monitored free trade zone. You are allowed to be here to do business, but you are not allowed to integrate.
That is a very accurate comparison. They were limited to stays of no more than 6 months. They had to leave before winter set in. When they did want to enter the city proper to conduct business in the markets, they had to adhere to strict rules. They could only enter through a specified gate, usually the Gate of St. Emilianus.
Right.
They could only enter in groups of 50 at a time. They had to be escorted at all times by imperial officials. And most importantly, they were completely disarmed before they walked through the gates.
No axes, no swords, no spears inside the city. But in exchange for submitting to these intense, almost humiliating regulations, the Byzantines provided extensive benefits. The Treaty of 911 specifically stipulates that the Byzantine emperor would provide the visiting Rus merchants with free food, bread, wine, meat, and fish, for the entire duration of their stay.
Which is a massive expense.
And they were also granted free access to the city's baths.
The Byzantine state was completely subsidizing their stay. Furthermore, when the 6-month trading window closed and the Rus were ready to return north, the Byzantine state would supply them with vital maritime equipment.
Like anchors and cordage.
Yes, anchors, heavy cordage, canvas for sails, and enough provisions to survive the initial journey back across the Black Sea.
This requires us to ask a strategic question, though.
Okay.
If the Rus were known primarily as violent raiders, and they had certainly attacked Constantinople in the past, putting the city under siege, why did the highly civilized, highly defended Byzantines let them camp right on their doorstep and give them free food, baths, and ship parts? It seems totally counterintuitive to subsidize a potential enemy like that.
It does seem strange at first, but it is actually a masterclass in Byzantine statecraft and soft power diplomacy. The Byzantines viewed trade not merely as an economic activity to make money, but as a critical tool of pacification.
Ah, so it's defense spending.
Exactly. They understood that the Rus were a significant, highly capable military threat. If they shut the gates and refused to trade, the Rus would simply attack the coastal suburbs and disrupt the empire's broader trade networks.
So you buy them off.
You integrate them. By strictly administering the trade, offering lavish maintenance at the state's expense, and granting them controlled access to the highly desired luxury goods they needed for their social status back home, the Byzantines effectively neutralized the military threat.
They turned potential invaders into dependent economic partners. If you attack the city, you lose access to the silk and the free anchors.
Precisely. The treaties also established comprehensive legal frameworks for resolving disputes between Rus and Greeks. They standardized procedures for ransoming slaves and protocols for handling the estates of merchants who died while in Byzantine
It's
territory.
extremely thorough.
The later Treaty of 944 even required the Rus merchants to carry official stamped certificates issued by the prince in Kiev to prove their identity and peaceful intent. It shows a massive level of bureaucratic control being imposed on what really started as a wild frontier trade.
The Byzantines were incredibly perceptive. They quickly realized that the most valuable resource coming down the river network wasn't necessarily the wax or even the furs.
No, it wasn't.
The most valuable commodity was the men themselves. These were heavily armed warriors who had survived the freezing rapids, the grueling portages, and constant ambushes by the Pechenegs. They were a formidable military asset.
And this realization leads us directly to the military and cultural synthesis that occurred between the two powers. The pivotal moment arrives in the year 988.
Okay, what happened in 988?
The Byzantine Emperor, Basil II, was facing a massive crisis. He was dealing with severe internal rebellions from his own military aristocracy, specifically a general named Bardas Phocas. Basil needed troops who had absolutely no ties to local Greek politics, so he reached out to Vladimir I, the Grand Prince of Kiev, and requested military assistance.
And Vladimir I obliges. He sends 6,000 elite Rus warriors down the trade route past the rapids straight to Constantinople to aid the emperor.
And these 6,000 heavily armed men formed the foundation of what became the famous Varangian Guard.
Right, the legendary Varangian Guard.
This unit became the elite personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperors for centuries. They were distinctly separate from the native Byzantine military units. They wielded massive two-handed battle axes, they wore heavy mail armor, and they had a reputation for absolute, unshakable loyalty to the office of the emperor.
Primarily because they were paid exceptionally well in gold, I assume.
Oh, absolutely. The sophisticated Byzantines, like the historian Michael Sellos, often referred to them using classical terms, calling them axe-bearing Scythians, projecting an ancient barbarian archetype onto them.
They secured the emperor's safety, and in return, they received incredibly high pay and access to vast Byzantine wealth. And much of that wealth, the gold solidi, the weapons, the silks, flowed back up the trade route to Scandinavia when these mercenaries retired and went home.
It was a huge influx of capital.
But the influence flowed both ways, leading to significant cultural blending along the route itself, particularly in the Kievan-Rus territories.
We see this cultural blending very clearly when we look at the archaeological record. At the Gnezdovo settlement, near that massive portage we discussed earlier, researchers have excavated over 3,000 burial mounds.
And what do they find in those mounds?
Well, when you examine the contents of these chamber graves, you do not find a pure Scandinavian culture or a pure Slavic culture. You find a distinct, synthesized mix.
You will find Scandinavian tortoise brooches. For those listening, these are large, domed bronze clasps that are classic Norse female jewelry used to hold up apron dresses.
Very recognizably Norse.
Right. But these distinctly Norse items are buried alongside local Slavic pottery. And even more telling, the burials often utilize Slavic cremation rites, rather than traditional Norse ship burials.
Which physically proves that the Varangians were rapidly adopting local customs. They were intermarrying with the Slavic populations and creating a hybrid culture.
We also see this deep synthesis in the linguistic legacy left behind. Old Norse loanwords entered the East Slavic vocabulary, particularly regarding administration and the law.
The Slavic word tiun, which means an official or a steward, comes directly from Old Norse.
Right.
The word garder, meaning a fortified settlement or an enclosure, heavily influenced the naming conventions of cities in the region. The Norse called Novgorod Holmgard and called Kiev Kunugard.
This raises a really revealing question about assimilation. How does this cultural trajectory compare to other Viking expansions? We know Vikings settled in England, creating the Danelaw, and they settled in France, creating Normandy, often imposing their culture. Did the Varangians conquer the Slavs, or did the Slavs absorb the Varangians?
It is a profound, rapid synthesis. The Varangians certainly provided the initial military force and the administrative framework through their Dracena retinues. They established the ruling Rurikid dynasty, which would govern the region for centuries.
So they were the political elite.
Initially, yes. However, the sheer demographics of the East European plain meant that the relatively small Varangian elite were quickly Slavicized. Within just a few generations, the ruling princes no longer had Norse names like Rurik or Helgi. They had adopted Slavic names like Sviatoslav and Vladimir.
And the ultimate cementing of this new unified hybrid identity occurred once again in that pivotal year of 988.
Yes, the Christianization of the Kievan Rus. As part of his military alliance with Basil II, and in order to marry the emperor's sister, Anna, Vladimir I agreed to be baptized into Eastern Orthodox Christianity in the Crimean city of Chersonesus.
But he didn't just convert himself, did he?
No. Upon returning to Kiev, he ordered the destruction of pagan idols and mandated the mass baptism of his entire populace in the Dnieper River.
This was a geopolitical earthquake. It tied the Kievan Rus directly to Byzantine Orthodox culture.
It completely changed their orientation.
It brought Greek literacy, ecclesiastical architecture, massive stone churches modeled on Byzantine designs, and a unifying, codified religious framework northward. It fundamentally transformed the Rus from a collection of violent pagan trading outposts into a centralized Christian state recognized by the major Mediterranean powers.
The Kievan Rus became a powerful, wealthy state, built almost entirely on the economic success of this single river highway. They controlled the flow of goods from the Baltic all the way to the Black Sea.
But history shows us that a state tied so closely to a single fragile trade route is acutely vulnerable to global shifts. And a series of compounding shifts eventually brought about the total decline of the Varangian Way.
The obsolescence of the route did not happen overnight. It occurred gradually from the late 11th through the 13th centuries, driven by several compounding internal and external factors. First, the Pecheneg threat, and later the threat from another nomadic group called the Cumans, escalated significantly.
The nomads just got stronger over time.
They did. Their blockades of the lower Dnieper became so severe and their control of the riverbanks so absolute that navigating the rapids went from being a dangerous, calculated risk to being nearly impossible.
The losses were just too high.
Exactly. The sheer loss of cargo and life disrupted the reliable flow of commerce.
Second, there was the internal fragmentation of the Kievan Rus itself. The state required a strong central authority to coordinate the massive Polyudi tribute collections and to fund the armies necessary to secure the long-distance trade convoys.
But after the death of Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise in 1054, that central authority collapsed.
Right. Yaroslav distributed his territories among his sons,
Which led to the realm fracturing into semi-independent competing principalities. His descendants engaged in chronic, destructive civil wars over succession and the title of Grand Prince of Kiev.
so they are fighting each other instead of protecting the route.
Exactly. This internal instability meant that the resources previously used to secure the trade route were now being used to fight each other. The logistical network just broke down.
You also had massive external geopolitical shifts altering the global economy at this time. The Crusades began in the late 11th century. When Western European armies and navies secured footholds in the Levant, it opened up alternative direct Mediterranean trade routes.
Which bypassed the north completely.
Right. Western European merchants from cities like Venice and Genoa could bypass the treacherous Black Sea and the grueling Russian rivers entirely to acquire Eastern spices and silks directly from Levantine ports.
Concurrently in the north, you have the rise of the Hanseatic League. This was a powerful, highly organized confederation of merchant guilds and market towns.
The Hanseatic League successfully reoriented Baltic trade westward, focusing on German ports like Lübeck.
And drawing Scandinavian economic interests away from the eastern river routes and toward the North Sea economy.
So between the nomads, the civil wars, the Crusades, and the Hanseatic League, the route faded from use. But its legacy is the subject of intense, sometimes vicious, modern scholarly debate. There is a long-standing, heavily politicized historical argument known as the Normanist versus anti-Normanist debate.
The Normanist view, traditionally held by many Western scholars, emphasizes that the Scandinavian Varangians were the primary catalysts for state formation in Eastern Europe. They argue that Norsemen built the trade network, provided the administrative structure, and essentially founded the Kievan Rus.
The anti-Normanist view, which has traditionally been championed by some Russian and Soviet historians, pushes back against that. They argue that the indigenous Slavic populations were already developing complex state structures and urban centers independently.
And that the Scandinavian influence was minimal.
Right, or that it was just superficial or secondary to the organic development of the region.
It is a debate fundamentally about the origins of Russian and Ukrainian statehood. But recently, the academic debate has taken an even more radical turn. Some modern scholars have stepped beyond the Normanist argument entirely and now actively deny that the route from the Varangians to the Greeks existed as a continuous highway at all.
They are essentially route denialists. They argue it is a historical fiction constructed by later medieval historians based on legendary, exaggerated accounts in the primary chronicle.
They point to the extreme difficulty of the watersheds. They argue that the portages were just too demanding for regular bulk transport. Or they suggest that the trade was highly localized neighbor trading with neighbor rather than a deliberate long-distance network linking Sweden to Greece.
I have to firmly push back on the denialists here based on the sources. If this route is just a later historical fiction, a mythological construct, how do we explain the massive volume of physical material evidence?
It's hard to ignore.
How do we explain the hundreds of thousands of Middle Eastern silver dirhams and Byzantine gold solidi physically buried in the soil of Sweden? Or the Swedish runestones? There are standing stones carved in Scandinavia that specifically commemorate men who died traveling to the east.
They explicitly mention places like Vidaholm or encounters with groups near the Danube.
That isn't mythology. That is memorializing a specific geographical reality.
To provide a balanced synthesis of the evidence, we really have to look closely at the hard science. The denialists are correct in one aspect. It is highly likely that the route was not a modern turnpike.
Sure.
It was not a system where a single crew boarded a ship in Birka, Sweden, and sailed uninterrupted, carrying the exact same cargo all the way to the docks of Constantinople without stopping.
Right. It wasn't a direct, non-stop flight. It wasn't one captain navigating the whole 3,000 kilometers.
Exactly. We should analyze it instead as a complex, relay-based network of overlapping regional markets. Goods changed hands multiple times. A Norse merchant might trap or trade furs in the north, bring them to a Rus middleman in Novgorod. That middleman transports the furs down to Kiev.
And then in Kiev, a different merchant loads them onto a fleet heading through the rapids to Constantinople.
But in totality, this connected network functioned flawlessly as a massive transcontinental artery.
And the scientific evidence aggressively supports this interconnectedness. Let's look at dendrochronology.
Dendrochronology is the scientific method of dating tree rings to the exact year they were formed.
Right.
When archaeologists examine the timber used to build the massive timber trackways and fortifications at settlements like Staraya Ladoga and Novgorod, the tree rings confirm massive synchronized construction phases.
They all built up at the same time.
These building booms align precisely with the peak years of the trade route, proving these were not isolated villages, but rapidly expanding logistical hubs reacting to massive economic volume.
We also have genetic isotope analysis, specifically looking at strontium. How does looking at a 1,000-year-old tooth tell us about a trade route?
Strontium is a naturally occurring mineral found in groundwater, and its exact chemical signature varies geographically based on the local bedrock. When a person drinks water during their childhood, that specific local strontium signature is permanently locked into their tooth enamel as it forms.
So it's like a geographical fingerprint.
Exactly. When archaeologists excavate the burials at Gazdovo, deep in the continental interior, and analyze the teeth of the people buried there, they find strontium signatures that do not match the local Dnieper River basin.
The signatures point directly back to Scandinavian and Baltic origins. The physical bodies of the people traveling the route, living and dying in these outposts, prove they were moving from the far north deep into the continental interior.
Combined with the massive coin hoards and the dendrochronology, the material and human exchange is definitively proven. Even if the logistical mechanics were more segmented and relay-based than a single continuous voyage, the Varangian Way was absolutely real.
We've covered the economics of the silver, the violence of the portages, the sophisticated diplomacy in Constantinople, and the hard science in the graves. But there is one final underlying factor that made this all possible, and it leaves us with a provocative thought about how we view history.
We really have to consider the overarching role of climate in human history. The peak operational centuries of the Varangian Way, from the 9th to the 11th centuries, coincided directly with a climatic phenomenon known as the medieval warm period.
During this time, average temperatures across northern Europe and the continent were noticeably higher than they are today. This seemingly minor shift had massive logistical implications.
It changed everything.
It meant that the northern rivers, the deep lakes, and the Baltic Sea were free of ice for significantly longer seasons.
The window for navigation was simply wider. The spring thaws, which flooded the rivers and made them deep enough to carry heavily loaded monoxalo over the shallows, were more predictable.
The water levels stayed higher.
The water levels in the river systems were sustained for longer periods, making those brutal portages and the navigation of the treacherous rapids physically possible for a longer stretch of the year.
It makes you ponder how much of human economic and political achievement, the rise of the Kievan Rus, the massive influx of wealth into the Byzantine Empire, the spread of global trade networks is quietly dictated by temporary environmental cooperation.
It's a humbling thought.
You think of a highway today, you picture asphalt defying nature. But the Varangian Way was a highway entirely at the mercy of nature. It existed, it thrived, and it generated immense wealth only because the rivers thawed on time, the forests provided the specific timber needed, and the climate allowed a brief, fragile window for human ambition to push through the mud and the rapids.
It was a fragile alignment of environment, economics, and sheer, uncompromising human endurance.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.